Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm continuing this tome. Full disclosure, I'm procrastinating my homework. And let's get into it. Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. I can't remember exactly where I left off. I'm just gonna start reading on this page. We're in chapter 3 now, called The Great Caliban, about, I can't remember. Well, this section is about the struggle against the rebel body. And I again forget where I left off. But they're talking about eradicating magic. Am I sure I read this? Well, I'll just start at the top of the page. Come on, you puppy. Well, it's a picture of like a man standing in a circle of magic symbols with like the devil. Oh, I guess the symbols are protecting it from the devil? Or no. Oh, it's like Faust. It says frontispiece to the first edition of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus 1604, picturing the magician conjuring the devil from the protected space of his magical circle. Okay, I'm just gonna fucking jump in here. I'm sorry for cursing. Eradicating these practices, like magical ones like herbs and charms, was a necessary condition for the capitalist rationalization of work, since magic appeared as an illicit form of power and an instrument to obtain what one wanted without words. Work. That is a refusal of work in action. Magic. I'm gonna. Should I sit at the desk? Magic kills industry, lamented Francis Bacon, admitting that nothing repelled him so much as the assumption that one could obtain results with a few idle expedients rather than with the sweat of one's brow. Magic, moreover, rested upon a qualitative conception of space and time that precluded a regularization of the labor process. How could the new entrepreneurs impose regular work patterns on a proletariat anchored in the belief that there are lucky and unlucky days? That is, days on which one can travel and others on which one should not move from home. Days on which to marry and others on which every enterprise should be cautiously avoided. Equally incompatible with the capitalist work discipline was a conception of the cosmos that attributed special powers to the individual. The magnetic look, the power to make oneself invisible, to leave one's body, to chain the will of others by magical incantations. It would not be fruitful to investigate whether these powers were real or imaginary. It can be said that all pre-capitalist societies have believed in them, and in recent times we have witnessed a revaluation of practices that at the time we refer to would have been condemned as witchcraft. Let us mention the growing interest in parapsychology and biofeedback practices that are increasingly applied even by mainstream medicine. The revival of magical beliefs is possible today because it no longer represents a social threat. The mechanization of the body is so constitutive of the individual that, at least in industrialized countries, giving space to the belief in occult forces does not jeopardize the regularity of social behavior. Astrology too can be allowed to return, with the certainty that even the most devoted consumer of astral charts will automatically consult the watch before going to work. However, this was not an option for the 17th century ruling class, which in this initial and experimental phase of capitalist development had not yet achieved the social control necessary to neutralize the practice of magic, nor could they functionally integrate magic into the organization of social life. From their viewpoint, it hardly mattered whether the powers that people claimed to have or aspired to have were real or not, for the very existence of magical beliefs was a source of social insubordination. Take, for example, the widespread belief in the possibility of finding hidden treasures by the help of magical charms. This was certainly an impediment to the institution of a rigorous and spontaneously accepted work discipline. Equally threatening was the use. Yo! Oh, sorry, excuse me. Because even while I'm doing this, I'm trying to upload something. Like, I'm trying to upload a earlier. Well, you don't care, but this old computer, like, I gotta watch it. So, what happened? This was certainly an impediment to the institution of work discipline. Equally threatening was the use that the lower classes made of prophecies, which, particularly during the English Civil War, as already in the Middle Ages, served to formulate a program of struggle. Prophecies are not simply the expression of a fatalistic resignation. Historically, they have been a means by which the poor have externalized their desires, given legitimacy to their plans, and have been spurred to action. Hobbes recognized this when he warned that there is nothing that so well directs men in their deliberations as the foresight of the sequels of their actions, prophecy being many times the principal cause of events foretold. How does it say? All right. But regardless of the dangers which magic posed, the bourgeoisie had to combat its power because it undermined the principle of individual responsibility, as magic placed the determinants of social action in the realm of the stars, out of their reach and control. Thus, in the rationalization of space and time that characterized the philosophical speculation of the 16th and 17th centuries, prophecy was replaced with the calculation of probabilities, whose advantage from a capitalist viewpoint is that here the future can be anticipated only insofar as the regularity and immutability of the system is assumed. That is, only insofar as it is assumed that the future will be like the past, and no major change, no revolution will upset the coordinates of individual decision making. Similarly, the bourgeoisie had to combat the assumption that it is possible to be in two places at the same time. For the fixation of the body in space and time, that is, the individual's spatio-temporal identification, is an essential condition for the regularity of the work process. The incompatibility of magic with the capitalist work discipline and the requirement of social control is one of the reasons why a campaign of terror was launched against it by the state, a terror applauded without reservations by many who are presently considered among the founders of scientific rationalism. Jean Baudin, Mersenne, the mechanical philosopher and member of the Royal Society Richard Boyle, and Newton's teacher Isaac Barrow. Even the materialist Hobbes, while keeping his distance, gave his approval. I don't like Hobbes at all. As for witches, he wrote, I think not that their witchcraft is any real power, but yet that they are justly punished for the false belief they have that they can do such mischief, joined with their purpose to do it if they can. Leviathan, 1963, page 67. He added that if these superstitions were eliminated, men would be much more fitted than they are for civil obedience. Like, why is that even something that you're concerned with, Hobbes? Like, what a weirdo. Like, you probably were such a fucking weirdo. Anyway. Hobbes was well advised. The stakes on which witches and other practitioners of magic died, and the chambers in which their tortures were executed, were a laboratory in which much social discipline was sedimented, and much knowledge about the body was gained. Here, those irrationalities were eliminated that stood in the way of the transformation of the individual and social body into a set of predictable and controllable mechanisms. And it was here again that the scientific use of torture was born, for blood and torture were necessary to breed an animal capable of regular, homogeneous, and uniform behavior, indelibly marked with the memory of the new rules. 1. To pick up a significant element in this context was the condemnation as maleficium of abortion and contraception, which consigned the female body, the uterus reduced to a machine for the reproduction of labor, into the hands of the state and the medical profession. I will return later to this point in the chapter on the witch hunt, where I argue that the persecution of the witches was the climax of the state intervention against the proletarian body in the modern era. Here let us stress that despite the violence deployed by the state, the disciplining of the proletariat proceeded slowly throughout the 17th century and into the 18th century in the face of a strong resistance that not even the fear of execution could overcome. An emblematic example of this resistance is analyzed by Peter Linbaugh in the Tyburn riots against the surgeons. Linbaugh reports that in the early 18th century London, at the time of an execution, a battle was fought by the friends and relatives of the condemned to prevent the assistance of the surgeons from seizing the corpse for use in anatomical studies. This battle was fierce because the fear of being dissected was no less than the fear of death. Dissection eliminated the possibility that the condemned might revive after a poorly executed hanging, as often occurred in the 18th century England. A magical conception of the body was spread among the people, according to which the body continued to live after death, and by death was enriched with new powers. It was believed that the dead possessed the power to come back again and exact their last revenge upon the living. It was also believed that a corpse had healing virtues, so that crowds of sick people gathered around the gallows expecting from the limbs of the dead effects as miraculous as those attributed to the touch of a king. Dissection thus appeared as a further infamy, a second and greater death, and the condemned spent their last days making sure that their body should not be abandoned into the hands of surgeons. This battle, significantly occurring at the foot of the gallows, demonstrates both the violence that presides over the scientific rationalization of the world and the clash of two opposite concepts of the body, two opposite investments in it. On one side, we have a concept of the body that sees it endowed with powers even after death. The corpse does not inspire repulsion, and it is not treated as something rotten or irreducibly alien. On the other, the body is seen as dead, even when still alive, insofar as it is conceived as a mechanical device to be taken apart just like any machine. At the gallows, standing at the conjunction of the Tyburn and Edgware roads, Peter Linebaugh writes, we find that the history of the London poor and the history of English science intersect. This was not a coincidence, nor was it a coincidence that the progress of anatomy depended on the ability of the surgeons to snatch the bodies of the hanged at Tyburn. The course of scientific rationalization was intimately connected to the attempt by the state to impose its control over an unwilling workforce. Yo, I'll be right back. I'm gonna pause it and be right back. Okay, so check this out. So somebody's getting tortured. This attempt of science to dominate the workforce and the body, this attempt was even more important as a determinant of new attitudes toward the body than the development of technology. As David Dixon argues, connecting the new scientific worldview to the increasing mechanization of production can only hold as a metaphor. Certainly, the clock and the automated devices that so much intrigued Descartes and his contemporaries, e.g., hydraulically moved statues, provided models for the new science and for the speculations of mechanical philosophy on the movements of the body. It is also true that starting from the 17th century, anatomical analogies were drawn from the workshops of the manufacturers. The arms were viewed as levers, the heart as a pump, the lungs as bellows, the eyes as lenses, the fist as a hammer. But these mechanical metaphors reflect not the influence of technology per se, but the fact that the machine was becoming the model of social behavior. The inspirational force of the need for social control is evident even in the field of astronomy. A classic example is that of Edmund Halley, the secretary of the Royal Society, who, in concomitance with the appearance in 1695 of the comet later named after him, organized clubs all over England in order to demonstrate the predictability of natural phenomena and to dispel the popular belief that comets announced social disorders. That the path of scientific rationalization intersected with the disciplining of the social body is even more evident in the social sciences. We can see, in fact, that their development was premised on the homogenization of social behavior and the construction of a prototypical individual to whom all would be expected to conform. In Marx's terms, that is, an abstract individual constructed in a uniform way as a social average and subject to a radical decharacterization so that all of its faculties can be grasped only in their most standardized aspects. The construction of this new individual was the basis for the development of what William Petty would later call, using Hobbes' terminology, political arithmetics, a new science that was to study every form of social behavior in terms of numbers, weights, and measures. These glasses are annoying. Petty's project was realized with the development of statistics and demography. Which perform on the social body the same operations that anatomy performs on the individual body, as they dissect the population and study its movements from natality to mortality rates, from generational to occupational structures, in their most massified and regular aspects. Also, from the point of view of the abstraction process that the individual underwent in the transition to capitalism, we can see that the development of the human machine was the main technological leap, the main step in the development of the productive forces that took place in the period of primitive accumulation. We can see, in other words, that the human body, and not the steam engine and not even the clock, was the first machine developed by capitalism. A telling example of the new mechanical conception of the body is this 16th century engraving, where the peasant is represented as nothing more than a means of production, which his body composed entirely of agricultural implements. That's fucked up. Also, J.K.'s Compendium Anatomicum 1696, in contrast to the mechanical man in this image of the vegetable man, in which the blood vessels are seen as twigs growing out of the human body. He's made of twigs. Twig man. Twig man, twig man. You can do things that a twig can. But if the body is a machine, one problem immediately emerges: how to make it work. Two different models of body government derived from the theories of mechanical philosophy. On one side, we have the Cartesian model that, starting from the assumption of a purely mechanical body, postulates the possibility of developing in the individual mechanisms of self-discipline, self-management, and self-regulation, allowing for voluntary work relations and government based on consent. On the other side, there is the Hobbesian model that, denying the possibility of a body-free reason, externalizes the functions of command, consigning them to the absolute authority of the state. The development of a self-management theory, starting from the mechanization of the body, is the focus of the philosophy of Descartes, who, let us remember it, completed his intellectual formation not in the France of monarchical absolutism, but in the bourgeois Holland, so congenial to his spirit that he elected it as his abode. Descartes' doctrines have a double aim: to deny that human behavior can be influenced by external factors such as the stars or celestial intelligences, and to free the soul from any bodily conditioning, thus making it capable of exercising an unlimited sovereignty over the body. Descartes believed that he could accomplish both tasks by demonstrating the mechanical nature of animal behavior. Nothing, he claimed, in his Le Monde of 1633 causes so many errors as the belief that animals have a soul like ours. Wow, first of all, offensive already. Thus, in preparation for his treatise of man, he devoted many months to studying the anatomy of animal organs. Every morning he went to the butcher to observe the quartering of the beasts. He even performed many vivisections, likely comforted by his belief that, being mere brutes, destitute of reason, the animals he dissected could not feel any pain. Wow, what a fucking asshole. To be able to demonstrate the brutality of animals was essential for Descartes because he was convinced that here he could find the answer to his questions concerning the location, nature, and extent of the power controlling human conduct. He believed that in the dissected animal, he would find proof that the body is only capable of mechanical and involuntary actions. What? That consequently it is not constructed constitutive of the person. Like, okay. And that the human essence therefore resides in purely immaterial faculties. The human body, too, is an automaton for Descartes, but what differentiates man from the beast and confers upon him mastery over the surrounding world is the presence of thought. Thus, the soul which Descartes displaces from the cosmos and the sphere of corporeality returns at the center of his philosophy, endowed with infinite power under the guise of individual reason and will. If anybody in 2018 subscribes to that shit, I'll punch you in your face. Placed in the soulless world and in a body machine, the Cartesian man, like Prospero, could then break his magic wand, becoming not only responsible for his own actions, but seemingly the center of all powers. And being divorced from its body, the rational self certainly lost its solidarity with its corporeal reality and with nature. Its solitude, however, was to be that of a king. In the Cartesian world of the person, there is no egalitarian dualism between the thinking head and the body machine, only a master-slave relation, since the primary task of the will is to dominate the body and the natural world. In the Cartesian model of the person, then, we see the same centralization of the functions of command that in the same period were occurring at the level of the state. That's crazy as shit for real. As the task of the state was to govern the social body. So the mind became sovereign in the new personality. Like, that's, alright, anyway, that's crazy though. Descartes concedes that the supremacy of the mind over the body is not easily achieved, as reason must confront its inner contradictions. Thus, in the passions of the soul, shut up, wow, he called his book, alright, the 1650. I'm just, he introduces us to the prospect of a constant battle between the lower and higher faculties of the soul, which he describes in almost military terms, appealing to our need to be brave and to gain the proper arms to resist the attacks of our passions. We must be prepared to suffer temporary defeats, for our will might not always be capable of changing or arresting its passions. It can, however, neutralize them by diverting its attention to some other thing, or it can restrain the movements to which they dispose the body. It can, in other words, prevent the passions from becoming actions. With the institution of a hierarchical relation between mind and body, Descartes developed the theoretical premises for the work discipline required by the developing capitalist economy. For the mind's supremacy over the body implies that the will can, in principle, control the needs, reactions, reflexes of the body. It can impose a regular order on its vital functions and force the body to work according to external specifications, independently of its desires. Most importantly, the supremacy of the will allows for the interiorization of the mechanisms of power. Thus, the counterpart of the mechanization of the body is the development of reason in its role as judge, inquisitor, manager, administrator. We find here the origins of bourgeois subjectivity as self-management, self-ownership, law, responsibility, with its corollaries of memory and identity. Here we also find the origin of that proliferation of micropowers that Michel Foucault has described in his critique of the juridico juridico-discursive model of power. The Cartesian model shows, however, that power can be decentered and diffused through the social body only to the extent that it is recentered in the person, which is thus reconstituted as a micro-state. In other words, in being diffused, power does not lose its vector, that is, its content and its aims, but simply acquires the collaboration of the self in their promotion. Consider in this context the thesis proposed by Brian Easlia, according to which the main benefit that Cartesian dualism offered to the capitalist class was the Christian defense of the immortality of the soul, and the possibility of defeating the atheism implicit in natural magic, which was loaded with subversive implications. Easily argues in support of this view that the defense of religion was a central theme in Cartesianism, which, particularly in its English version, never forgot that no spirit, no God, no bishop, no king. Easly's argument is attractive, yet its insistence on the reactionary elements in Descartes' thought make it impossible for Easly to answer a question that he himself raises. Why was the hold of Cartesianism in Europe so strong that even after Newtonian physics dispelled the belief in a natural world void of occult powers, and even after the advent of religious tolerance, Cartesianism continued to shape the dominant worldview? I suggest that the popularity of Cartesianism among the middle and upper class was directly related to the program of self-mastery that Descartes' philosophy promoted. In its social implications, this program was as important to Descartes' elite contemporaries as the hegemonic relation between humans and nature that is legitimized by Cartesian dualism. The development of self-management, i.e., self-government, self-development, becomes an essential requirement in a capitalist socio-economic system, in which self-ownership is assumed to be the fundamental social relation, and discipline no longer relies purely on external coercion. The social significance of Cartesian philosophy lies in part in the fact that it provides an intellectual justification for it. In this way, Descartes' theory of self-management defeats, but also recuperates the active side of natural magic, for it replaces the unpredictable power of the magician, built on the subtle manipulation of astral influences and correspondences, with a power far more profitable, a power for which no soul has to be forfeited, generated only through the administration and domination of one's body, and by extension, the administration and domination of the bodies of other fellow beings. We cannot say then, as Easily does, repeating a criticism raised by Leibniz, that Cartesianism failed to translate its tenets into a set of practical regulations. That is, that it failed to demonstrate to the philosophers, and above all to the merchants and manufacturers, how they would benefit from it in their attempt to control the matter of the world. If Cartesianism failed to give a technological translation of its precepts, it nonetheless provided precious information with regard to the development of human technology, Its insights into the dynamics of self-control would lead to the construction of a new model of the person, wherein the individual would function at once as both master and slave. It is because it interpreted so well the requirements of the capitalist work discipline that Descartes' doctrine, by the end of the 17th century, had spread throughout Europe and survived even the advent of vitalistic biology, as well as the increasing obsolescence of the mechanistic paradigm. The reasons for Descartes' triumph are clearest when we compare his account of the person with that of his English rival Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes' biological monism rejects the postulate of an immaterial mind or soul that is the basis of Descartes' concept of the person, and with it the Cartesian assumption that the human will can free itself from corporeal and instinctual determinism. For Hobbes, human behavior is a conglomerate of reflex actions that follow precise natural laws and compel the individual to incessantly strive for power and domination over others. Thus, the war of all against all in a hypothetical state of nature, and the necessity for an absolute power guaranteeing, through fear and punishment, the survival of the individual in society. For the laws of nature, as justice, equity, modesty, mercy, and in some doing to others as we would have done to of themselves without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions, that carry us to partiality, pride, revenge, and the like. As is well known, Hobbes' political doctrine caused a scandal among his contemporaries, who considered it dangerous and subversive, so much so that although he strongly desired it, Hobbes was never admitted to the Royal Society. Against Hobbes, it was the Cartesian model that prevailed, for it expressed the already active tendency to democratize the mechanisms of social discipline. By attributing to the individual will that function of command which, in the Hobbesian model, is left solely in the hands of the state. As many critics of Hobbes maintained, the foundations of public discipline must be rooted in the hearts of men, for in the absence of an interior legislation, men are invariably led to revolution. In Hobbes, complained Henry Moore, there is no freedom of will, and consequently no remorse of conscience or reason, but only what pleases the one with the longest sword. Ooh, god damn it. More explicit was Alexander Ross, who observed that it is the curb of conscience that restrains men from rebellion. There is no outward law or force more powerful. There is no judge so severe, no torturer so cruel as an accusing conscience. The contemporaneous critique of Hobbes' atheism and materialism was clearly not motivated purely by religious concerns. His view of the individual as a machine, moved only by its appetites and aversions, was rejected, not because it eliminated the concept of the human creature made in the image of God, but because it eliminated the possibility of a form of social control, not depending wholly on the iron rule of the state. Here, I argue, is the main difference between Hobbes' philosophy, and Cartesianism. This, however, cannot be seen if we insist on stressing the feudal elements in Descartes' philosophy, and in particular its defense of the existence of God, with all that this entailed as a defense of the power of the state. If we do privilege the feudal Descartes, we miss the fact that the elimination of the religious element in Hobbes, i.e., the belief in the existence of incorporeal substances, was actually a response to the democratization implicit in the Cartesian model of self-mastery, which Hobbes undoubtedly distrusted. As the activism of the Puritan sect during the English Civil War had demonstrated, self-mastery could easily turn into a subversive proposition. For the Puritans' appeal to return the management of one's behavior to the individual conscience, and to make of one's conscience the ultimate judge of truth, had become radicalized in the hands of the sectaries into an anarchic refusal of established authority. The example of the diggers and ranters, and of the scores of mechanic preachers who, in the name of the light of conscience, had opposed state legislation as well as private property, must have convinced Hobbes that the appeal to reason was a dangerously double-edged weapon. The conflict between Cartesian theism and Hobbesian materialism was to be resolved in time, in their reciprocal assimilation, and in the sense that, as always in the history of capitalism, the decentralization of the mechanisms of command through their their location in the individual was finally obtained only to the extent that a centralization occurred in the power of the state. To put this resolution in the terms in which the debate was posed in the course of the English Civil War, neither the diggers nor absolutism, but a well-calculated mixture of both, whereby the democratization of command would rest on the shoulders of a state always ready, like the Newtonian God, to reimpose order on the souls who proceeded too far in the ways of self-determination. The crux of the matter was lucidly expressed by Joseph Glanville, a Cartesian member of the Royal Society, who in a polemic against Hobbes argued that the crucial issue was the control of the mind over the body. This, however, did not simply imply the control of the ruling class, the mind par excellence, over the body proletariat, but equally important, the development of the capacity for self-control within the person. As Foucault has demonstrated, the mechanization of the body did not only involve the repression of desires, emotions, or forms of behavior that were to be eradicated. It also involved the development of new faculties in the individual that would appear as other with respect to the body itself and became the agents of its transformation. The product of this alienation from the body, in other words, was the development of individual identity, conceived precisely as otherness from the body and in perennial antagonism with it. The emergence of this alter ego and the determination of a historic conflict between mind and body represent the birth of the individual in capitalist society. It would become a typical characteristic of the individual molded by the capitalist work discipline to confront one's body as an alien reality to be assessed, developed, and kept at bay in order to obtain from it the desired results. As we pointed out, among the lower classes, the development of self-management as self-discipline remained for a long time an object of speculation How little self-discipline was expected from the common people can be judged from the fact that right into the 18th century, 160 crimes in England were punishable by death. And every year, thousands of common people were transported to the colonies or condemned to the galleys. Moreover, when the populace appealed to reason, it was to voice anti-authoritarian demands, since self-mastery at the popular level meant the rejection of the established authority rather than the interiorization of social rule. Indeed, through the 17th century, self-management remained a bourgeois prerogative. As Easlia points out, when the philosophers speak of man as a rational being, they made exclusive reference to a small elite made of white, upper class, adult males. The great multitude of men, wrote Henry Power, an English follower of Descartes, resembles rather Descartes' automata, as they lack any reasoning power and only as a metaphor can be called men. The better sorts agreed that the proletariat was of a different race. In their eyes, made suspicious by fear, the proletariat appeared as a great beast, a many-headed monster, wild, vociferous, given to any excess. On an individual level as well, a ritual vocabulary identified the masses as purely instinctual beings. Thus, in the Elizabethan literature, the beggar is always lusty and sturdy, rude, hot-headed, disorderly, are the ever-recurrent terms in any discussion of the lower class. In this process, not only did the body lose all naturalistic connotations, but a body function began to emerge in the sense that the body became a purely relational term, no longer signifying any specific reality, but identifying instead any impediment to the domination of reason. This means that while the proletariat became a body, the body became the proletariat. And in particular, the weak, irrational female, the woman in us, as Hamlet was to say, or the wild African, being purely defined through its limiting function, that is, through its otherness from reason, and treated as an agent of internal subversion. Yet the struggle against this great beast was not solely directed against the lower sort of people. It was also interiorized by the dominant classes in the battle they waged against their own natural state. As we have seen, no less than Prospero, the bourgeoisie, too had to recognize that this thing of darkness is mine. That is, that Caliban was part of itself. This awareness pervades the literary production of the 16th and 17th centuries. The terminology is revealing. Even those who did not follow Descartes saw the body as a beast that has to be kept incessantly under control. Its instincts were compared to subjects to be governed. The senses were seen as prison for the reasoning soul. Oh, who shall from this dungeon raise a soul enslaved so many ways? Asked Andrew Marvell in his dialogue between the soul and the body. With bolts of bones that fettered stand, and feet and manacled in hands, here blinded with an eye, and there deaf with the drumming of an ear, a soul hung up, as 'twere in chain of nerves and arteries and veins. The conflict between appetites and reason was a key theme in Elizabethan literature. While among the Puritans, the idea began to take hold that the Antichrist is in every man. Meanwhile, debates on education and on the nature of man, current among the middle sort, centered around the body-mind conflict, posing the crucial question of whether human beings are voluntary or involuntary agents. But the definition of a new relation with the body did not remain at a purely ideological level. Many practices began to appear in daily life to signal the deep transformations occurring in this domain. The use of cutlery, the development of shame with respect to nakedness, the advent of manners that attempted to regulate how one laughed, walked, sneezed, how one should behave at the table, and to what extent one could sing, joke, play. While the individual was increasingly dissociated from the body, the latter became an object of constant observation, as if it were an enemy. The body began to inspire fear and repugnance. The body of man is full of filth, declared Jonathan Edwards, whose attitude is typical of the Puritan experience, where the subjugation of the body was a daily practice. Particularly repugnant were those bodily functions that directly confronted men with their animality. Witness the case of Cotton Mather, who in his diary confessed how humiliated he felt one day when, urinating against a wall, he saw a dog doing the same. Thought I, what vile and mean things are the children of men in this mortal state! How much do our natural necessities abase us and place us in some regard on the same level with the very dogs! Accordingly, Accordingly, I resolved that it should be my ordinary practice, whenever I step, to answer the one or the other necessity of nature, to make it an opportunity, shaping my mind some holy, noble, divine thought. Fuck you, Cotton Mather. Suck my dick. The great medical passion of the time. The analysis of excrements. What? What? From which manifold deductions were drawn on the psychological tendency of the individual, vices or virtues. Is also to be traced back to this conception of the body as a receptacle of filth and hidden dangers. Clearly, this obsession with human excrements reflected in part the disgust that the middle class was beginning to feel for the non-productive aspects of the body, a disgust inevitably accentuated in an urban environment where excrements pose a logistical problem, in addition to appearing as pure waste. But in this obsession, we can also read the bourgeois need to regulate and cleanse the body machine from any element that could interrupt its activity and create dead time in the expenditure of labor. Excrements were so much analyzed and debased because they were the symbol of the ill humors that were believed to dwell in the body, to which every perverse tendency in human beings was attributed. For the Puritans, they became the visible sign of the corruption of human nature, a sort of original sin that had to be combated, subjugated, exorcised, hence the use of purges, emetics, and enemas that were administered to children or the possessed to make them expel their devilries. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. In this obsessive attempt to conquer the body in its most intimate recesses, we see reflected the same passion with which, in these same years, the bourgeoisie tried to conquer, we should say colonize, that alien, dangerous, unproductive being that in its eyes was the proletariat. For the proletarian was the great Caliban of the time. The proletarian was that material being by itself raw and undigested, that Petty recommended be consigned to the hands of the state, which in its prudence must better it, manage it, and shape it to its advantage. Honestly, like, this is disturbing, frankly. Like Caliban, the proletariat personified the ill humors that hid in the social body, beginning with the disgusting monsters of idleness and drunkenness. Yo, in the eyes of his masters, its life was pure inertia, but at the same time was uncontrolled passion and unbridled fantasy, ever ready to explode in riotous commotions. Above all, it was indiscipline, lack of productivity, incontinence, lust for immediate physical satisfaction. Its utopia being not a life of labor, but the land of Caliban, where houses were made of sugar, rivers of milk, and where not only could one obtain what one wished without effort, but one was paid to eat and drink. To sleep 1 hour of deep sleep without waking, one earns 6 francs, and to drink well, one earns a pistol. This country is jolly, one earns 10 francs a day to make love. The idea of transforming this lazy being who dreamt of life as a long carnival into an indefatigable worker must have seemed a desperate enterprise. It meant literally to turn the world upside down, but in a totally capitalist fashion, where inertia to command would be transformed into lack of desire and autonomous will, where vis erotica would become vis lavorativa. Wait, and where need would be experienced only as lack, abstinence, and internal indigence. Hence, this battle against the body, which characterized the early phase of capitalist development, and which has continued in different ways to our day. Hence, that mechanization of the body, which was the project of the new natural philosophy and the focal point for the first experiments in the organization of the state. If we move from the witch hunt to the speculations of mechanical philosophy and the Puritans' meticulous investigations of individual talents, we see that a single thread ties the seemingly divergent paths of social legislation, religious reform, and the scientific rationalization of the universe. This was the attempt to rationalize human nature, whose powers had to be rechanneled and subordinated to the development and formation of labor power. As we have seen, the body was increasingly politicized in this process. It was denaturalized and redefined as the other, the outer limit of social discipline. Thus, the birth of the body in the 17th century also marked its end, as the concept of the body would cease to define a specific organic reality and become instead a political signifier of class relations, and of the shifting, continuously redrawn boundaries with which these relations produce in the map of human exploitation. Okay, I made it to the end of chapter 3. There's a lot of end notes. Now we have 2 chapters left. The next chapter is The Great Witch Hunt in Europe, which I think will be very exciting. Thank you for watching my video. I'm happy to be back and look forward to continuing. If you like the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye YouTube. See you soon. XOXO.